Well, hello everybody, my name is Dave Bristow and we are at my little home studio on Bainbridge Island, Seattle, Washington, USA. And I have here as a guest Emmanuel Brockhaus, and I am happy to be contributing to his website, which we can see here, Cult Sounds. And my interview, of course, is about the voices of the DX7. So just a quick little history about how that all worked back in the 1980s, right, Emmanuel? So it was in 1980 when I was first introduced to the Yamaha's GS1 FM synthesizer, which was it was an 8-operator FM synthesizer, and at the time I didn't have a clue what FM was. So 8-operator, 10-operator didn't mean anything to me, and I was there with someone who was to become a firm friend, Gary Leuenberger, and the two of us were introduced to this instrument, and we essentially taught ourselves how to program it, because it was just a 2-operator or 4 multiples of 2 operators. It was relatively contained, and that was our introduction to FM. But I can honestly say that we didn't really know much about the theory at all. I knew about synthesizers, what other musicians at the time knew, filters, envelopes, and that was about it. But anyway, we plugged away with the GS1 and gradually got a feel for how FM operators contributed to the sound, and specifically how they contributed to touch, which was a significant part of the GS1. And then, of course, in 1982, we get to see the first prototypes of the DX7. And after 2 years of working with the GS1 and the GS2, from my own perspective, I was ready for more operators and more complex algorithms. The way things worked for voicing at the time is that Gary and I had been asked to each prepare about 16 voices. We'd been given a prototype DX7, which we took back to our relative homes and studios and worked with it. And I came up with 16 or 17 sounds, and I can remember calling Gary a couple of weeks before the big trip back to Japan. How many sounds have you done, Gary? He said, I've got about 18. I said, great. We've got, that makes what, 35, 36 sounds? We're good. Because we'll have a couple of days in Japan to polish them and make the 32 sounds for the factory, which is what they wanted. Anyway, we show up, and I can remember that first meeting on Monday morning in the studio. Bristow-san, Leuenberger-san, we have news for you. Oh, thank you. What is the news? We have decided for 128 presets, not 32. So, my jaw drops. I've been spending months developing these 16 sounds for the DX7, the same with Gary. And so we said, okay, rolled our sleeves up. We better start now, because they literally had to be ready by the end of the week. Essentially, Thursday night, ready for Friday morning. That was it. And with all the production schedules and so on, we had to move. So I can remember my first comment to Gary on when we were sitting together in the studio in front of these 2 DX7s sitting there, and I said, can you think of 128 instruments? And we couldn't. We went through the instruments of the orchestra. Well, there's violins, pianos, brass, oboes, don't forget. And clarinets. Oh, yes. And, by the time we got to 40 sounds, we'd run out. So we just played with the instruments. And as we played and we heard things, it gradually triggered ideas, and we realized that there were certain sounds which were important. The velocity sensing of the keyboard and the way that this worked with the higher level modulating operators was so musical and expressive. As we played, we realized there's important sounds here. And so we played with different ideas and began to focus on things like brass, pianos. We realized pretty quick that we couldn't get at the time a really good acoustic piano sound. However, the electric piano sound, it was as if we could take a Fender Rhodes and clean it up a little bit as you know, and I'd been playing Fender Rhodes in bands for a long time, and Gary had as well. And, you know, we knew how we'd like them to sound. So, you know, a little bit of brightening, maybe a little bit of extra time noise, a little bit of extra decay on the time noise, and so on. And we soon found that programming electric pianos was one of the most satisfying things that we could do. And I think Gary was mainly responsible for that very pretty, tiny Rhodes sound, which became so popular and that you've tracked on the site. I made my fair share of those pianos too. I was always a little bit more interested in the sort of knocky, brassy type sounds from the Fender Rhodes. So this is what I like. It's what I still like. And I think, as I mentioned when we were having coffee, Emmanuel, when I use this CP4 electric piano. I'm always pulling up the 1973 Fender Rhodes, you know. Yeah, it was the experience with the two operators on GS1 and GS2, which gave us a feel for that electric piano thing. I think FM lent itself to making electric pianos. It's a piano, so you want that touch. It's very important to piano players, but it has to be controlled and subtle and right. You know, we could tweak the tine sound, make it prettier, make it more bell-like. We found that layering it with other instruments, it worked very well. That piano sound layered very well with simple pads, sine wave pads. It layered very well. And I think making electric pianos was one of the most satisfying things. That and the brass. And then for myself, what happened after that, I really got into guitar sounds and the fact that when you release the key, you could introduce all sorts of noises and squeaks. And I loved the squeaks. The squeaks and the bonks and the little bits of noise when you play. I loved being able to do that with FM. And I know we used to call that stuff. We put it in quotes. You've got to have stuff on a sound. And really enjoyed voicing that. But all of this happened, between, I want to say 1980 and 1985, 86. It was the same sort of thing. Essentially, the DX didn't change from 1983 till the SY99. That fundamental FM, 6-operator FM thing was still there. Feedback was a very important part of the FM. Smoothed out the spectral shape, more of a sawtoothy sort of waveform being generated, a little more akin to what a lot of people were familiar with analog synths. I always felt that the DX was potentially a warm instrument. Lots of people felt otherwise. But I do say potentially warm. I think a lot of the sounds, the early sounds, erred on the sort of digital bright side because that's what it did so easily. Making FM warm is something that you do have to think about, but it's absolutely possible. And I always, get a little bit, when I hear people saying the DX was not a warm instrument. It was. You could get some beautiful, smooth sounds, both in terms of lead playing and for pads, obviously. Of course, it didn't have an effects engine tacked on the output. That always makes a difference. That's going to smooth things out. If you're adding a chorus or a phaser or flanger and so on, that always makes a big difference. And the DX7 didn't have that. We're talking raw stuff. It was raw audio coming out the back of a DX7. But anyway, that was about it. It was a good time voicing all that stuff. And I'm so thrilled that people still use it. And as I mentioned, Emmanuel, just last week I was finding some voices for Hermeto Pascoal down in Brazil. What a treat and honor that is to be doing stuff for people like that. And it's been that story right back since 1980, even to now, And look at me now, I'm sort of sitting in my, in my studio just doing my thing. You might be quite happy, but people still enjoy these voices, which is so nice.